Some people do not enter history with the pounding of horses' hooves, nor with a flashing sword in the middle of a square. They arrive like a question, quietly, persistently, refusing to fall asleep. And Francis Bacon was such a person. What happens when a mind longs deeply for truth, yet the heart cannot entirely turn away from the invitation of power? What happens when a man wishes to clear away the errors in the human mind, yet his own life leaves behind scratches that are hard to erase from conscience and honor? Tonight, in the gentle slowness of deep sleep of power, we will not rush to answer those questions. We will only softly open the door, and behind that door is the London of many centuries ago. A London immersed in a thin mist, where the warm yellow light of candles spills over old pages, where the sound of carriage wheels rolling far away across damp, cold streets feels like the rhythm of time, passing through the sleep of the city. In that setting, Francis Bacon does not appear like a perfect marble statue, but like a lamp that is both shining and trembling. He was a man who helped open the way to a new manner of thinking about knowledge, a new way of looking at error, a new road leading toward modern science. But he was also a man of the court, of ambition, of beautiful rooms heavy with the scent of compromise. In Bacon, the light of intellect could not be separated from the shadow of fame. And perhaps that is precisely why his story has remained alive far longer than the easy praises offered to people who are altogether too smooth and complete. Some people teach us through victory. Some people teach us through failure. But Francis Bacon seems to teach us through both. He reminds humanity that the human mind often sees the world through layers of mist made of prejudice, language, habit, and the ready-built stages of thought erected inside the mind. He tells us that if we wish to draw near to the truth, we must first learn to question the very way we look. And yet his life also gently, though bitterly, reminds us of something else. That knowing much does not necessarily mean living rightly. That great intelligence does not automatically bring with it flawless character. And so, tonight's story is not merely the story of a great historical figure. It is also the story of a deeply human paradox. A man standing between two currents. On one side, the longing to illuminate the intellect of humankind. On the other, the quiet pull of status, influence, and power. And when those two streams meet, the surface of the river is no longer still. If you love stories told slowly, deeply, and gently enough to accompany you towards sleep, stay with Deep Sleep of Power, and do not forget to subscribe to support this journey. Every bit of your companionship is a small candle that keeps these old stories lit through the night. And now, as the mist beyond the window seems to have settled a little lower, we will step back from that damp and chilly city, back through corridors of power, back through the sound of carriage wheels and the smell of old paper, to find the place where this story began. A house where power and letters breathed beneath the same roof. As though from a very early hour, fate had already quietly placed into Bacon's cradle two seeds that would never consent to live peacefully beside one another. If we step a little farther back from the fog of London, back through the thick wooden doors, past the yellow candlelight, breathing quietly upon the walls, we will arrive at a house where power and letters lived together beneath the same roof. That was York House. Not merely a residence, but almost a space where the breathing of the court could be heard in every footstep, every letter, every visit, every deliberate pause between words that seemed merely polite. It was there that Francis Bacon was born. He was not born at the edge of power. nor did he grow up in an innocence removed from the affairs of his age. From the time he was still a child, he was placed between two very strong, very different currents of influence, which throughout his life would remain entwined within him like two threads, unwilling to part. One current came from his father, Sir Nicholas Bacon, a man of law, order, and a distinctly English reserve. In him there was the calmness of those who understand that real power does not always need to raise its voice. It often exists in careful measurement, in the ability to wait for the right moment, in the habit of weighing matters before setting pen to anything that might alter the course of another person's fate. With such a father, the home was not merely a place of rest. It was also a place where the boy Francis, though not yet old enough to understand everything, could still sense that the adult world was governed by invisible principles, by rank, by prestige, by laws, and by a kind of quiet strength, heavier than noise. The other current of influence came from his mother, Anne Cook Bacon, a learned, disciplined, deeply moral woman who especially cherished the discipline of the intellect. If his father showed Francis the outward shape of power, then his mother seemed to place within him another world entirely, the world of language, of books, of ancient texts, of seriousness in thought, and of the belief that the human mind should not be left to the mercy of laziness. Beside her, letters were not ornamental, they were disciplined. They were a way of training the mind into uprightness. They were a way of keeping the soul from drifting too easily toward the noisy temptations of life. And so, Francis Bacon grew up not only among beautiful walls and corridors through which distinguished visitors came and went, but also between two forms of order. One was the court's order, and the other was the order of thought. Perhaps that was what gave his childhood its own particular shade. It was not quite the childhood of a child freely wandering through open fields, nor was it entirely the dry childhood of a boy who knew only how to bow over books. It was like a room with two windows. One opened onto the great world of adult affairs, where rank, duty, and influence quietly passed by one another each day. The other opened onto the world of learning, where words were weighed, where morality was not a gentle suggestion, but a stern demand. A child born into such an atmosphere often learns very early that words carry weight, that an idea may lift a person, but may also bind that person to itself, that there are rooms which seem silent, yet that silence is full of power, and that there are books which appear very still on the outside, yet within them hold quiet commands for an entire life. We may imagine the young Francis walking through the corridors of York House, with eyes still small before the world, yet already beginning to retain more than appearances alone. Perhaps at that time, he did not yet know how to name the forces that were growing within him. He did not yet know that one day he himself would have to live within the court, contend with fate, with rank, with money, with reputation, and at last, with conscience. But the seeds had already been planted very early. The seed of a man who wished to understand the world, and also the seed of a man who could not remain indifferent to a world divided by power. That is what makes this story beautiful and also sad. When we look into the childhood of Francis Bacon, we do not see only a fortunate beginning. We see an arrangement that feels almost fated, as though from his very first cradle, his life had been placed between two callings. One calling urged him upward toward knowledge, toward great principles, toward clearer methods for the human mind. The other pulled him toward the rooms where power was given, held, negotiated, and sometimes exchanged. On one side was the light of thought. On the other hand, There was the difficult-to-resist warmth of a real-life position, and throughout his life, Bacon would never fully escape that struggle. But at this stage, everything was still very early. The great conflicts of the future were still sleeping beneath the soft blanket of childhood. There were only the first disciplines, the first lessons, the first impressions of a world built out of law and letters. There was only a boy growing up in a house where every breath seemed to remind him that a human being must learn how to stand upright in the middle of life. And then, like a small flame that often begins in silence before becoming bright enough for anyone to notice, that childhood would soon reveal another quality, not the strength of the body, but the strength of observation, not the noisiness of a child eager to rush into the world, but the quietness of a mind beginning to look at the world through windows, through books, through silences, and through the very blurred marks that adults imagine children are still too young to see. Some children grow up through long runs across the fields, through afternoons spent chasing the wind, through ringing laughter on sunlit roads. And some children grow up in a different rhythm, slower, quieter, nearer to the window than to the horizon. Francis Bacon seems to have belonged to that second rhythm. He was not the kind of boy the whole household remembered for noise or physical vigor. On the contrary, Bacon's early years were often covered by the fragile feeling of a body that was not truly strong. Perhaps it was precisely that frailty which kept him indoors more than out in the streets, nearer to bookshelves than to amusements, nearer to thought than to display. And sometimes, what life takes away in strength, it gives back in another capacity. The capacity to look longer, listen more deeply, and feel the small blurred movements that the healthy, the busy, and the overly eager in the face of the world often so easily overlook. We may imagine the boy Francis sitting by a dim glass window, watching the grey light of London change colour upon the rooftops, watching people pass by without truly belonging to them. A child like that learns early the art of observation, not the kind of observation that judges, but the kind that moves together with silence. When others pass through life as though walking through a familiar corridor, quiet souls often linger longer before the same door. They look at the hinge, at the scratch on the wood, at the small sound made when a hand pushes the door open, and little by little, they come to understand that the world is built not only from what it reveals, but also from what it conceals. Bacon's childhood, therefore, should not be told as the story of a cold prodigy born only to conquer books. That way of seeing him is too dry, and also too easy. More truly, he was a boy who lived deeply within his inner life. There were long hours of self-study there, the stern influence of a learned mother, the habit of reading and reflecting as though letters were not merely knowledge, but also a kind of quiet discipline for the soul. In a house where words carried weight and books were not there merely for display, Bacon grew up with the sense that thought must be honed as one hones a slender blade, not too showy, not too hurried, but sharp enough to cut through the surface of things. His mother, with the strictness of learning and morality, surely helped make that boy understand early that the mind should not be left to the mercy of laziness. Every word must be weighed, every thought must be examined, every belief, if left untested, may become too comfortable a chair, causing a person to sit down and forget how to rise again and keep walking. Perhaps it was precisely in this very early stretch of life, in the near compulsory stillness of a weak body, that Bacon began to see something he would carry with him all his life. Human beings do not err only because they lack knowledge. They also err because the very way they look at the world has already been bent from within. A child in the street often sees movement. A child by the window often sees patterns. Bacon seems to have recognized early that adults do not always live by the truth. They live by habit, by repeated language, by what others have believed before them, by the authority of great names, by conclusions that come too quickly, simply because they are convenient or familiar. Surely at that time, he did not yet have the full language to name all these things. But the first seed must already have been sown, the seed of doubt toward what seems all too obvious. It was a very strange kind of flame. It did not flare up into sound. It did not turn him into a boy fond of noisy rebellion. On the contrary, it burned in a smoldering way, like fire beneath ashes, a flame of difference in the way of seeing life. When many people were content with ready-made answers, Bacon perhaps had already begun to wonder how those answers were made. When many people believed in the solemn appearance of words, he had gradually begun to feel that words, too, are sometimes a curtain. When many people bowed before inherited knowledge, he was beginning to dimly see that not everything old is true, and that not everything repeated many times is any closer to the truth. But those first recognitions were still very soft, very small, like the first stroke of ink on a page, still wide and open. They were not yet a system of thought, not yet a method, not yet a doctrine. They were only the feeling of a young mind that between human beings and the world, there always exists a layer of mist. And that mist does not lie only outside in the London air. It also lies within the gaze itself, within language, within prejudice, within the very things we imagine we know most clearly. Perhaps that is why Bacon's frail early years were not merely a secondary stretch of life. They were on the ground. It was precisely those quiet years that prepared for a later life that would try to place a great question before all humanity. How can human beings know rightly when their own minds are always so easily enchanted by distorted mirrors they do not even realize are there? And then, when that small flame had become warm enough to keep itself alive in the wind, life would lead Bacon away from those familiar windows and into a place more solemn, older, and also more stifling. There, knowledge no longer rested quietly on bookshelves at home, but put on ceremonial robes, climbed the lectern, and sat in rows within the halls of learning. But not every room filled with books is spacious enough for thought. There are places where the more learning is worshipped, the harder the air becomes to breathe, as though intelligence, when kept too long inside beautiful cages, begins to forget how to fly. And then there came a moment when the window frames in the old house were no longer wide enough for a mind that was growing. When the flame of seeing life differently had quietly taken root in the boy Francis Bacon, life led him to a place many noble families of that age believed was the bridge into adulthood: Cambridge. At first glance, it must have seemed a deeply venerable world. Ancient walls marked by time, stone corridors holding the footsteps of so many generations of scholars, lecture halls where knowledge was passed on with a solemnity almost religious in nature. For many young people, it was a place that opened the mind, a place where one learned how to step out of childhood and into the world of reason, reputation, and profession. But for Bacon, Cambridge did not entirely appear as a garden of intellectual freedom. It appeared, earlier than others might have expected, as a garden that had been trimmed too neatly. There, learning had a beautiful form. It had order. It had tradition. It had great names repeated in reverent tones, as though by leaning on the authority of the ancients, truth would automatically become safe. But precisely within that atmosphere, seemingly so full of intelligence, Bacon began to feel a very particular weariness. Not a weariness from studying too much, but a weariness from knowledge being confined inside cages polished too carefully. His years at Cambridge left in him a deep impression. People could say a great deal about the world and still touch very little of it. They could argue with great skill about the nature of things without ever stooping to observe those things with their own eyes. They could build tiers of concepts so high that they nearly touched the vaulted ceilings of the lecture halls, yet still failed to take a single step closer to the truth that lay quietly beyond the window. In the wind, in the earth, in the human body, in the simple phenomena of life. Perhaps what unsettled Bacon was not only the content of what he was being taught, but also the way people learned, a manner of thought too dependent on authority, too accustomed to bowing before old works, too ready to confuse the precision of argument with the living truth of experience. There, the mind was sometimes not invited to discover, but trained to walk along paths already drawn. It was not encouraged to doubt at the root, but was often permitted only to debate within the fences of things already acknowledged beforehand. For many people, those fences created a sense of security, but for a mind like Bacon's, they began to suggest suffocation. We may imagine a young man sitting in a cold lecture hall, listening to discourses arranged with skill, propriety, and an almost flawless order. And precisely because they were so rounded, so polished, they made him weary. Not because he lacked the ability to keep up, but perhaps because he was beginning to feel that an intellect that knows only how to move in exquisite circles will eventually forget the sky. That was an important realization, and also a lonely one. At a young age, not everyone is calm enough to distinguish between respect for tradition and blind submission to tradition. Not everyone is quiet enough to hear the small cry of the mind when it is forced to live too long in rooms without air. Bacon seems to have heard that cry very early. He began to suspect that knowledge, if it only revolves around commenting on what has already been said, will gradually become a mirror reflecting a mirror. Reflection layered upon reflection. The more there is, the farther it drifts from the thing itself. There's a gentle sadness in that discovery, for Cambridge ought to have been the place that illuminated the faith of youth. Yet for Bacon, it was also the place that first revealed the limits of the learning of his age. He did not turn his back on knowledge. On the contrary, he respected knowledge too deeply to bear seeing it imprisoned in ritual, in scholasticism, in debates drifting farther and farther from the ground. It was precisely because he still loved truth that he began to grow weary of how people treated it. And perhaps from here, a thought still vague, yet enduring, began to grow within him. If human beings truly wished to understand the world, they would have to learn again how to step out of closed classrooms. They would have to look, touch, try, test, compare, and observe. They would have to accept that the mind cannot live forever on the inheritance of those who came before, as though living on food reheated from a feast long gone. There comes a time when it must go out on its own, stand in the wind, face things themselves, and learn to listen to reality rather than merely listening to the echoes of books. But at this moment, all of that was still only the earliest outline. It had not yet become a system, not yet a declaration, not yet a method clear enough to write down for humanity. It was like the feeling of a young man standing in a room full of candles and yet still finding the light insufficient. The problem did not lie in the number of candles. The problem was that the windows had been closed for too long. Cambridge, therefore, gave Bacon not only knowledge, it gave him an intellectual dissatisfaction, a precious dissatisfaction that would later become the source of an entirely new path of thought. Sometimes great revolutions do not begin with thunder. They begin with a very private feeling, the weariness of having to go on breathing in an atmosphere that has grown old. And then, as though fate understood that a mind which has begun to doubt cages should not be kept too long in the same room, life opened another path before him. No longer cold stone lecture halls and dry debates, but a broader, farther horizon where politics, diplomacy, and the world outside the walls of the academy began to speak. There, among foreign cities and other courts, Bacon would see that the mist covering, truth did not lie only in ancient books, but also drifted across all of Europe, slipping into power, into language, and into the beautiful masks of human life. Leaving behind the cold stone walls of Cambridge, Francis Bacon stepped into an entirely different landscape, broader, softer, more complex, and also more real. If Cambridge taught him that the intellect could be imprisoned in cages polished by tradition, then Paris showed him something even harder to forget. Even after stepping out of the lecture hall, one has not necessarily stepped any closer to the truth. Paris, at the end of the 16th century, was not merely a city. It was a stage already lit. There were palaces there, embassies, velvet-covered reception rooms, letters passing back and forth between courts, ceremonies that seemed mere formality. Yet within every bow, every glance, every well-timed silence, power moved quietly like water beneath a thin layer of ice. And the young Francis Bacon, still very young, began to learn in precisely that place. He went to France in the retinue of Sir Amyas Paulet, the English ambassador at the French court. This was not the kind of learning with clear lectures, a master standing at a lectern, and concepts neatly enclosed in books. This was another kind of learning from observing people when they said one thing, but wished others to understand another. Learning from letters in which every sentence was weighed like gold. Learning from news, negotiation, ceremony, conflict, and above all from the fragile distance between name and reality. Perhaps in Paris, Bacon began to understand more deeply that the world does not operate as scholastic minds imagine. It is not always clear, not always straightforward, not always set before the eyes like a proposition that, once proven, is closed. Real life is far more complex than that. In real life, what matters is not only what people say, but also what they hide. Not only what is written down, but also what is left blank. Not only the outward appearance of order, but also the hidden collisions beneath the velvet fabric of ceremony. For a mind like Bacon's, Paris must have been a strange and captivating school. There, he did not merely see people arguing about the world. He saw them living in that world, colliding with it, concealing themselves within it, negotiating with it, and sometimes being swallowed by it, while still keeping a composed expression upon their faces. This was a place where knowledge could not remain still upon paper. It had to know how to look at a face, how to read a voice, how to listen even to silence. It had to go together with observation, with patience, with a very subtle sense of the way reality veils itself. It may have been precisely there, among those diplomatic corridors and those candle-lit rooms, that Bacon learned a quiet lesson that would prove decisive for his whole life. Truth does not step out before human beings of its own accord It usually stands behind a curtain. To draw near to it, one needs not only books, but also the eye, experience, method, and a clear-mindedness before the beauty of performances. Paris, therefore, did not merely widen Bacon's horizon concerning politics and the world of Europe. It also ripened a bigger change within him. If at Cambridge he had begun to grow weary of dry and closed-off learning, then in Paris he saw what knowledge needed to become. A tool alive enough, flexible enough, close enough to life, not to lose its way among what human beings present and what they actually do. In other words, he began to learn not only how to know, but also how to read reality. We may picture Francis Bacon in those years as a man standing very still at the edge of the stage, in no hurry to step to its center, yet with eyes that never ceased to take things in. He saw courts as machines wrapped in velvet, outwardly soft, inwardly full of iron gears. He saw human speech as both a bridge and a mask. He saw the power of language, but also the danger of language when it no longer served truth, but instead served to conceal truth politely. His years in France, therefore, were not a secondary episode at the margin of Bacon's life. They were one of its important hinges. Here, he began to move beyond the condition of a young man merely dissatisfied with old ways of learning, and to draw nearer to the condition of a man who would spend his whole life asking anew how human beings seek knowledge. Books still mattered, but books alone were no longer enough. Human beings had to learn from life in motion. They had to learn from nature, from institutions, from behavior, from error, from patient observation of what reality does, and not only of what people say about reality. And like many great lessons in life, that lesson came not with thunder, but by gradual absorption. An audience, a letter, a negotiation, a piece of news from the court, a handshake given too quickly, a smile too perfectly measured, a very slight disparity between appearance and essence. Little by little, Paris taught Bacon that to understand the world, one must be patient enough to see through the fabric draped over the world. But life seldom allows any period of learning to last long enough to become peaceful. When a mind is still opening itself to reality, fate is often already quietly preparing another cut. And then, just as Bacon was still standing at the intersection of youth, knowledge, and hope, bad news from home would arrive like cold wind slipping through the crack of a door. From that point on, the lessons of diplomacy and the truth hidden behind curtains would no longer stand apart. They would begin to travel together with money, lack, appearances, and the very ordinary burdens of life. Those things which sometimes silently bend the destiny of a person more than any great idea ever could. Some events come into life without making much noise. They are not like a storm throwing open the windows in a violent night. They are more like a lamp suddenly going out in a room that has long been familiarly lit, and only when the darkness pours down do people understand how much they had been leaning on that light. For Francis Bacon, the death of his father was such a moment. While still in France, still learning how to look at the world through layers of ceremony, diplomacy, and power, he was still a young man who could think that behind him there remained a house strong enough, a name weighty enough, a support firm enough that if his steps happened to waver, life would not yet tilt entirely to one side. But then Sir Nicholas Bacon died, and in a movement that came almost without warning, the ground beneath Francis changed. To lose a father, first of all, is to lose a human being, to lose the steady low voice of law and order in the old house, to lose the great shadow of a man who had once stood very near the center of power, yet still preserved the calm bearing of one who knew that the weight of rank does not lie in display. For a son like Francis, that alone was already a deep enough emptiness. But in families tied to the court, private grief is rarely permitted to remain private. It quickly brings with it consequences colder, harder, less tearful, but far more lingering. The death of a father leaves not only an emptiness in the heart, it also leaves emptiness in property, in arrangement, in the future. Plans perhaps left unfinished, assurances not yet completed. Doors that were expected to open at the right moment suddenly close, or open more slowly, more narrowly, more coldly. And from that point on, Francis Bacon began to enter a very earthly lesson: material lack. This is what makes his story deeper than an ordinary glorious biography. Many of the spiritual tragedies of human beings do not begin from great ideas, but from very small, very ordinary pressures that keep tightening like a thin cord, a bill that must be paid, a position that must be maintained, an appearance that cannot be allowed to collapse before the eyes of others, a life in which too many things once taken for granted suddenly become fragile after a single piece of bad news. From here onward, Bacon was no longer merely a young man pursuing knowledge as a kind of spiritual adventure. Life forced him to think about how to endure, not only how to understand the world, but how to stand within it, not only how to become an exceptional intellect, but how not to slip down from the step he had once been born so near. There is a very hidden sorrow in that kind of pressure. It is not as loud as naked poverty, but it is no lighter. It is the tension of those who must maintain appearances while inwardly cracking, who must appear as though they still belong to a certain class, a certain rhythm of life, a certain standard, while in reality, things have already begun to thin beneath each of their steps. For those born near power, falling from one's former place is not merely the loss of comfort. At times, it feels like losing part of one's social face, and Bacon, very likely, felt that invisible yoke begin tightening around his neck early on. Debt does not usually arrive like an enemy wearing armor. It comes like mist. At first, it is only a thin layer, a shortage that can be managed, a hope that tomorrow things will be enough. Then little by little it seeps into everything, into decisions, into relationships, into sleep, into the way a person looks at himself in the mirror. It causes a man to worry not only about money, but about dignity, about position, about the feeling of slipping away from the place that ought to have been his. That is why, when we look at Francis Bacon during this stretch of life, we should not imagine him as a man of mere ambition chasing power out of a cold hunger for fame. That is too simple, and also too unfair to the complexity of a human life. More truly, he was beginning to be pushed into a life in which aspiration, self-respect, anxiety, and the need to survive became entwined. He not only wanted to rise, he also needed to mend a tear that fate had ripped open too early. That is where Bacon's tragedy begins to take shape. From this point forward, law and public life would no longer be merely honorable roads upon which a great intellect might step to test itself. They would also become bridges that had to be crossed to keep themselves from sinking. And when a person enters power carrying both ideals and private pressures, their choices are rarely ever completely pure. Every step forward may carry a little self-rescue. Every door that opens may at once be both an invitation and a trap. The debts of money, therefore, in this story are not merely a biographical detail. They are a kind of quiet weather. They settled over Bacon's mind like a long-lasting climate, making many of his later decisions impossible to fully understand if separated from the sense of lack that began here. From a loss within the family, his life gradually drifted into an orbit where position was no longer the ornament of ambition, but a form of self-preservation. And sometimes it is precisely at that point that people begin to pay life not with coins made of silver anymore, but with the peace of their conscience. Looking back, we may see that a very fine crack has just appeared. No one hears any sound yet. No one has named the tragedy yet. No one knows that the boy who once looked at life through a window, the young man who once suffocated in lecture halls, the student who once shaped among the curtains of Paris, has now crossed into another threshold, where thought must put on its coat and step out into life. And life is not gentle with minds that have no support. And then, out of that mist of insufficiency, London will appear once again. No longer the London of introduction, but the London of the legal profession, of Parliament, of long corridors and doors opened only just enough. There, Bacon will begin to live like a man always standing very near the machine of power, near enough to hear clearly the turning of its gears, yet still not invited to sit in the place that would make all that movement truly belong to him. London opened before Francis Bacon once again, but this time it was no longer the city of childhood, of family corridors and the shadow of his father stretching over his life like a sturdy roof. This was a different London, more practical, colder, filled with the rustling of papers, the sound of shoes upon stone floors, the clash of argument against argument in rooms where people lived not only by ideas, but also by position, by the ability to press forward at the right moment, and by the art of standing close enough to power without being swallowed by it too soon. At Gray's Inn, Bacon entered the world of law with a mind already prepared from many directions. A childhood among letters, the suffocation of Cambridge, the observations of Paris, and above all, the mark left by want after his father's death. And so, for him, the law was not merely a profession, it was a path, a structure, a kind of language through which a man might move nearer to the centers that governed the fate of the nation. Gray's Inn, for Bacon, was surely not only a place to learn statutes and precedents, it was also the place where he refined another ability, the ability to give his thoughts a form solid enough to step out into life. There, an idea could not merely be beautiful. It had to be sharp. It could not only feel right. It had to stand up before rebuttal, before procedure, before the searching gaze of those accustomed to living among debate and doubt. For a man like Bacon, this was ground both fitting and painful. Fitting, because he had intellect and the ability to join observation with argument. Painful, because he understood that the law, like every human institution, is not always the perfect scale of justice. It is also a tool in the hands of those who know how to use it more skillfully than others. And then from Gray's Inn, the road opened toward Parliament. There, Bacon began to appear as a young man gifted in speech, in writing, and above all, in seeing the structure beneath problems. Parliament gave him a broader stage than the law courts, no longer only individual cases, but the questions of an entire kingdom, money, policy, royal authority, interest, order. It was the place where people discussed not only right and wrong, but the things that might keep a nation standing firm or cause it to tilt. And Bacon, with the quickness of his intellect, was certainly not a man fading dimly into some shadowed corner. But it was precisely here that one distinctive feeling of his life began to emerge more clearly than ever. He was always very close to the door of power, yet never truly inside. It was a strange position, and a wearying one. Some people are shut out from the center altogether. They suffer in an obvious way, but some are allowed to stand just outside the threshold, near enough to hear the voices within, near enough to see the light slipping through the crack of the door, near enough to know that they have talent, achievement, and the ability to serve greatly, and yet they must still wait. For them, life does not slam the door in their face. Life merely leaves it ajar just enough that hope does not die, and just enough that impatience never fully falls asleep. Francis Bacon was such a man. He had learning, he had a political mind, he had literary talent. He could make others respect his intellect, but he also carried with him one quiet disadvantage. He was not wealthy enough to remain entirely indifferent to circumstance, not independent enough to turn away from the need for support, and not naive enough not to understand that in England at that time, talent rarely opened every door by itself. And so Gray's Inn and Parliament were not merely steps upward. Some corridors prolonged the feeling of not yet having arrived. Bacon moved through that world like a man who always had to prove a little more. Write one more petition, deliver one more speech, seek one more connection, wait for one more opportunity. And the longer he waited, the more painful the tension became between his true worth and his actual position. This is the point at which Bacon's life begins to take on a shade that is very human, very easy for viewers today to recognize in themselves. For many of us, too, have lived through such years, knowing we have the ability, feeling we were born not merely to stand at the edge, yet day after day still having to remain very near the thing we long for without being able to touch it. The weariness of that condition is not the weariness of complete failure. It is the weariness of prolonged hope. And prolonged hope, when joined with financial pressure and self-respect, often leads a person toward a deeper need, the need to be seen, recognized, and drawn across the threshold by a powerful hand. That is why these years are so important if we wish to understand Bacon fairly. He did not move toward power merely because he was dazzled by its light. He moved toward it also because he believed he had a place within it, believed that his intellect ought not to be wasted in the hallway outside, believed that he could contribute to governance, to law, to an order greater than himself. But at the same time, want and insecurity made that desire no longer wholly idealistic. Into it, there began to mix impatience, dependence, and a longing for patronage that would later exact no light price. At Gray's Inn and in Parliament, Bacon learned another lesson that perhaps no book can ever fully teach. In public life, talent is necessary, but it is rarely enough. To go far, one also needs networks, timing, favor, and sometimes a person powerful enough to say to the world, "This door, open it for him." And then, as though fate had heard that waiting for a very long time, a noble figure would enter Bacon's life with both generosity and danger in equal measure. At first, that hand might seem like a bridge stretched across the land of insufficiency, but many bridges in life do not merely carry us to the other shore. There are bridges which, the moment we step upon them, place upon us the first debt that later cannot easily be repaid with money, with gratitude, or with silence. When a person has stood too long in the hallway of power, what they long for is not always a throne. Sometimes they need only an arm on their shoulder and a voice saying, "I see you." For Francis Bacon, in those years when his talent was acknowledged but fortune remained slow, the appearance of the Earl of Essex must have carried something close to that feeling. It was an encounter between two unlike temperaments. Essex was the kind of man who entered a room as though bringing the wind with him. He was radiant, impulsive, full of heat and generosity, and belonged to that kind of person whose very presence makes others feel that life is moving faster. In such people, power does not appear as a cold set of scales, but as a flame, beautiful, dangerous, and endowed with an almost instinctive power of attraction. Bacon, by contrast, was different. He was not a flame flaring up in the middle of a great hall. He was more like a slender blade hidden in velvet, deep, cool, weighty with intellect, and more accustomed to watching the machine operate from within than to burning himself into light for the world outside. If Essex belonged to the rhythm of the heart, then Bacon belonged to the rhythm of thought. If Essex was impulse, then Bacon was calculation, and it was precisely because they were so different that they were drawn toward one another. In life, sometimes we seek out those who resemble us so that we may feel at ease. But there are also times when we are drawn to those unlike ourselves, as though the still missing part of our own life quietly recognizes something in them. Perhaps between Essex and Bacon, there was something of that as well. For Bacon, Essex was not merely a noble acquaintance. He was a bridge stretched across the abyss of waiting, of insufficiency, of the feeling of having been delayed too long outside the threshold. Essex brought Bacon what the years at Gray's Inn and in Parliament had still not fully given him: opportunity, patronage, money, position, and most importantly of all, a sense that at last fate had sent him a hand to lift him. In a world where talent rarely climbed to the summit entirely by itself, such support was not merely precious, it was almost a condition for breathing. We may imagine Bacon during this stretch of life as a man who has walked too long upon a narrow bridge in the mist. Beneath his feet lies the abyss of debt, of fragile appearances, of the anxiety of preserving one's place in society. And then, from ahead, Essex appears like a lantern carried in the hand, not clearing away all the mist, not changing the nature of the bridge itself, but at least making the stretch of road ahead a little less cold. That is why this relationship should not be told too simply as an entry in a ledger between benefactor and betrayer. It must be held in its very human complexity. For Bacon did not receive from Essex only material things or influence. Perhaps he also received from that blazing man something gentler and harder to name: hope. Hope that his life had not yet been sealed behind half-open doors. Hope that his intellect would, in time, find its rightful place. Hope that he would no longer have to keep walking while quietly hearing the footsteps of debt behind him. But there are bridges on which the longer one walks, the more clearly one hears the wood begin to crack beneath one's feet. The difference between Essex and Bacon was not something that produced attraction alone. It was also the seed of distance. Essex lived largely by impulse, by honor, by the heat of feeling and spirit. Bacon lived largely by deliberation, by structure, by a far-seeing vision that was also cooler. One man could rush forward before calculating all the consequences. The other often saw the consequences very early, sometimes so early that his very lucidity made it hard for him to embrace the fiery nature of the companion beside him. At first, that difference may have complemented them, but later, it would often become the source of a quiet misalignment. One man wanted to be faithful to his feelings. The other wanted to be faithful to survival. One believed that there are moments when one must burn brightly to preserve oneself. The other understood all too clearly that in politics, burning brightly often only brings the darkness sooner. That is the beautiful yet sorrowful fragility of this stretch of life. Essex raised Bacon, but at the same time drew him closer to the region where every bond of favor may become a trial. In relationships bound by power, the greatest gift is often accompanied by the deepest debt. Money may be repaid little by little. Lodging may be exchanged through service. Patronage may be answered with loyalty. But when a man helps not only to make one's life less burdened, but also helps one feel that fate has not entirely abandoned him, that debt begins to touch a place deeper than money. It touches self-respect. And once self-respect enters a relationship, every subsequent move becomes more dangerous. Perhaps Bacon did not yet see the full price that would have to be paid, or perhaps he saw it, but could not turn away. For human life rarely allows us to choose between what is entirely pure and what is entirely wrong. More often, it places before us a bridge that must be crossed, a bridge that saves us from one real abyss, but leads us toward another night we have not yet recognized. That is why the period with Essex must be told as a stretch of brightness veiled in mist. There was friendship there, or at least a bond real enough not to be dismissed lightly. There was generosity, there was gratitude, there was hope, there was a need to lean on another. But beneath it all, there was already the very soft sound of water flowing beneath the bridge. The sound of fate, the sound of politics, the sound of different natures walking together upon a plank, growing narrower by the day. And then there would come a time when that bridge would no longer be merely a place to cross. It would become the place where a man must choose to which side of the abyss he belongs. There, private feeling, law, loyalty, the fear of collapse, and the instinct for self-preservation would stand facing one another like candles in the same enclosed room. Each flame would have its own light, but when the wind slipped through, not every flame would still be allowed to burn according to its own will. There are nights in history that need no storm to feel colder than many winters, not because the wind is stronger, but because something in the air has just broken. A trust, a bond, a bridge that once carried two people across an abyss, now suddenly giving off the sound of cracking that everyone standing upon it can hear, even if no one wishes to be the first to admit it. For Francis Bacon, the year 1601 was such a darkness. The man who had once supported him, once given him opportunity, money, standing, and hope, the Earl of Essex, had now fallen. The flame that had once warmed many hearts and unsettled many others had, in the end, burned too close to the curtains of power. And when that flame came to be seen as a threat, the court no longer regarded it as a thing of beauty. They regarded it as something that had to be extinguished. This is where Bacon's story enters its deepest gray region. From the outside, everything seems very clear. Essex was brought to trial. Bacon stood on the side of the crown and the law. From this point on, his name became bound to a question that posterity has never ceased to return to. Was this a necessary act on the part of a statesman, or a stain of betrayal that could never be washed away? But if we tell this story too quickly, too flatly, we lose the very thing that makes it still painful even today. Human beings rarely make great choices with entirely transparent hearts. Let us try to slow down a little. We remember that Bacon did not come into public life from a position of abundance. He had passed through a youth of delay, through material want, through the feeling of standing too long outside the door of power. He understood that political life is not a place for beautiful gestures if they lead to self-destruction. He also understood that in the world of the court, once a man has fallen from royal favor, very few can pull him back by private feeling alone. And it is precisely at that point that the moral tragedy appears. Bacon was not unaware of what Essex had once been to him. Perhaps he knew it more clearly than most others. It was precisely because he knew that his choice could not be light. It was precisely because he still remembered that the spiritual cost of that choice could not be cheap. But the life of power has a cruelty of its own. It does not often permit people to preserve both their loyalties and their position in full. At a certain point, each person is forced to answer which one they will lose first. And Bacon answered in a way that left his reputation forever no longer whole. We may imagine him in those days as a man standing in a room heavy with the smell of old wood and candle wax, hearing each accusation echo not only through the air but through his own memory. On one side stood the law, the crown, the order he believed had to be preserved if a nation wished to avoid chaos. On the other stood a relationship that could not be reduced to ordinary acquaintance, a debt of opportunity, of support, of hands that had once pulled him through difficult years. When those two callings collide, no choice remains clean. If he had stood on Essex's side, could he have saved him? Or would he only have fallen alongside a fate already beginning to close? If he stood on the side of the crown, was that the clear-sightedness of a man who understood the nature of politics too well? Or was it the moment when the survival instinct crossed a boundary that the heart knew to be painful, even as the mind still nodded in assent? Perhaps what makes this part of his life so haunting is not that it gives us an answer, but that it refuses every easy answer. To say that Bacon betrayed him is not entirely wrong, but to say only that is too little. It overlooks the pressure upon a man who had lived too long in want, too near power not to understand the price of standing on the wrong side, and too familiar with the structure of power not to know that personal loyalty seldom triumphs over the machinery of the state once that machinery has decided to crush someone. To say that Bacon was simply doing what needed to be done for the order of the realm is also not enough. That way of speaking dissolves the moral pain in his choice. It turns a tragedy into a procedure. And yet what remains with posterity is not merely the political act. However, the chill that comes from seeing a great mind choose what was institutionally right, while still leaving behind a deeply human wound in the deeper region of conscience. That is why this chapter must be told like a distant bell. It does not need to be harsh. It does not need to condemn. It only needs to go on resonating. From here onward, the image of Francis Bacon is never again as clear as it once was. His intellect remained great. His vision of knowledge would still help open the way for an entire age. But from this moment on, that light no longer stood alone. It always moved together with a shadow, and that shadow bore the name of a question that cannot be extinguished. Can a man help open the way to truth for humanity, and yet not pass through his own life with wholly clean hands? Perhaps that is precisely why Bacon's story still makes people pause longer than simpler heroic portraits do. He does not offer us the comfort of a figure to be merely admired or merely despised. He forces us to remain in the dim region of the human condition, where reason, gratitude, fear, self-respect, survival, and ambition are wound so tightly together that even the one standing within it cannot be sure he still knows how to distinguish between justice, self-preservation, and the thing that will follow him like a footstep, never wholly leaving the space behind him. But history, like the night, rarely lingers long over a wound. After that dark interval, the hinge of the age would turn again. A new reign would open, and with it, the thing Bacon had long watched from afar throughout his youth. Real power, a real seat, rooms at the center, would at last begin to turn toward him. Only sometimes a dream that arrives too late no longer resembles the dawn. It resembles, instead, the lamplight in a luxurious room, beautiful, sheltered from the wind, but not always easy to breathe in. After many long years of standing at the edge of the light, perhaps Francis Bacon had at times believed that his life would remain forever, like a lamp placed outside the hallway, bright enough for others to see, yet never set in the very center of the room. And then, when the age changed hands, when James I ascended the throne, the door beside which Bacon had stood for so many years finally opened wider for him. It was a very strange kind of dawn, not the dawn of youth, when every hope still carries the scent of newness. This was a dawn that came after many seasons of waiting, after the cracks in reputation, after debts of money and debts of the spirit, after a whole stretch of life spent learning how to walk very near to power without yet being granted the right to sit down. And so, when fortune finally turned its face back toward him, Bacon's joy probably did not take the form of blazing excitement. It was more like a long breath in a room where another window has just been opened, a relief, but no longer innocent. Under James I, his path upward became unmistakable. Honor came, the office came. The recognition that in his youth he could only look at from afar now began to take on a real shape, a real seat, a real power. From the first steps of royal favor, Bacon gradually moved into the center of government, until he reached the height that years before he could only have dreamed of in silence: the Lord Chancellorship. From the outside, this part of his life is very easy to see as a triumph. And indeed, it was a triumph in many senses. A man who had been delayed far too long was finally given what he believed he deserved. An intellect that had spent so many years knocking on closed doors no longer stood at the threshold. A person who had lived with the feeling of slipping footing could now place both feet upon the stone floor of a position. But in the spirit of deep sleep of power, this is not a passage in which the light should burn too brightly. For some, flowers bloom in the gardens of spring, and there are also flowers that bloom in a greenhouse, beautiful, precious, carefully tended, but not always breathing natural air. The higher Bacon rose, the deeper he stepped into rooms where the velvet curtains were thicker, the words softer, but the weight of every silence much greater. Power here was not noisy. It was wrapped in ceremony, in title, in the solemn appearance of law and court. But precisely because it was wrapped so beautifully, it became harder to breathe quietly. A man at the center no longer carries only his own ambition. He must carry the expectations of the king, the scrutiny of others, the fragility of honor, and the feeling that just one small misstep could turn the ladder he has climbed over half a lifetime into a very long slope downward. Perhaps in this stretch of life, Bacon finally attained the thing he had long pursued, the right to influence the order of the nation. This was no longer the position of a man, merely offering counsel from the hallway outside. This was the position of a man truly laying hands upon the gears of the machine. for a mind that had long reflected on how the world ought to be understood, corrected, and better arranged, that must have held immense attraction. Power in his eyes was not only the light of status, it was also the ability to turn thought into structure, words into decisions, intellect into effect. And it is precisely there that Bacon's dream of power takes on its most persuasive form. He did not merely want to be raised, he wanted to be useful at a great height. But life rarely allows a triumph to keep all of its clarity. Once a person has gone too deeply into the world of position, even his private life begins to take on the color of arrangement. In this period, Bacon's marriage appears not so much as a warm refuge for the soul, but as part of the effort to make life more stable, more secure, more fitting to his station. That does not mean it was wholly without feeling. Only what seems to have guided it was not the gentle flame of intimacy, but the need to build a household suited to the step on which he was now standing. And this is precisely where this part of his life begins to grow cold. For when even private happiness must pass through the hand of calculation, a person gradually begins to live inside a very particular kind of success. Fuller than before, yet not necessarily warmer than before. Bacon had reached the place he wished to reach, but arriving does not mean resting. On the contrary, some heights keep people awake longer in the night, because from there one can see not only the landscape, but also the abyss at one's feet. Perhaps in those years, Francis Bacon was like a man who had finally stepped into the room of his dreams, only to discover that the room was not quiet at all. It was full of whispers, full of glances, full of responsibility, full of small concessions that outsiders could scarcely see. The more recognized he became, the more he had to keep himself from slipping out of that role. The more he became a symbol of success, the harder it became for him to live as a simple human being. That is the beautiful and sorrowful paradox of power. It gives people the feeling of completing a dream, while at the same time forcing them to pay for it with the peace they once possessed before entering the center. But amid all those velvet curtains, honors, offices, and recognitions, another movement was also taking place within Bacon, quieter, steadier, and perhaps truer than all the noises of the court. The more he lived among power, the more clearly he saw something he had sensed from very early on. Humanity's greatest errors do not always come from outside. They often begin from within the gaze itself, within language, within prejudice, within the stages of thought that the mind constructs and then sits before as though they were truth. And so, once the chambers of power have shown both, their beauty and their suffocation, we shall leave behind the velvet curtains, the lofty seat, the titles both bright and cold, and enter a place far more enclosed, the human mind itself, where the layers of mist no longer drift beyond the window of London, but lie still within the way we think, the way we name, and the way we believe in the world. If, in the outer world, people often fear roads covered in mist, then Francis Bacon reminds us that the most dangerous mist sometimes does not lie in the street, does not drift across the face of a river, does not settle upon the rooftops of London at midnight. It lies within the mind itself. It lies in the way we see, the way we name, the way we believe, and even in the things we imagine we have understood all too clearly. This is perhaps one of Bacon's deepest ideas, and it is also what makes him feel modern even today. For he did not begin by asking, "Where is the world wrong?" He began with a more unsettling but more truthful question. Might the human mind itself be distorting the world before we have even had time to understand it? In other words, Bacon did not entirely trust the transparency of the mind. He did not regard the intellect as a clean pane of glass that one needs only to place before reality for it to reflect things correctly. To him, the human mind was more like a distorted mirror. It reflects, but not the whole. It receives light, but it also bends that light according to the invisible curves of habit, desire, language, and prior belief. And to explain why human beings are so often wrong while still imagining themselves to be right, Bacon offered a beautiful and haunting image. The 4 idols. The word idols here does not mean stone statues standing in temples. It means the illusions before which human beings unconsciously kneel, not with their knees, but with their thinking. The first idol is the tribe's idol. These are the errors that arise from the common nature of humanity itself. We are human, and so we often wish to see order where order may not truly exist. We wish to see patterns where there may only be a few coincidences. We wish to believe what reassures us more than what is actually true. We look at the world not only with our eyes, but with our desires. And that desire, light as mist, is enough to bend the whole horizon. Bacon seems to be saying that the human race has a habit that is at once very gentle and very dangerous. We do not merely observe the world. We also unconsciously force the world to resemble what we are waiting to find in it. When we like an idea, we easily begin to see evidence for it everywhere. When we fear something, we begin to detect signs of it everywhere. The mind, therefore, is no longer an honest recorder. It becomes a painter in too much haste, adding color before the landscape has fully appeared. The second idol is the idol of the cave. If the idol of the tribe is the shared distortion of humankind, then the cave is the private distortion of each individual. Each of us lives within a little cave of our own. The cave of childhood, of education, of experience, of injury, of preference, of temperament. Some people look at life through the mouth of a cave shaped by fear, some through the mouth of pride, some through the mouth of a few books read too early, or a few unhealed wounds that make them believe the world can only ever be one color. Bacon understood this very well, perhaps because he himself was also a man of many caves. A childhood amid the court, a severe education, political life, ambition, disappointment. He knew that no one steps out to look at the world in a completely naked state. We always carry our cave upon our shoulders, and if we are not sufficiently alert, we will imagine that the light entering the cave is the whole of the sun. The third idol is the marketplace idol. This is perhaps one of Bacon's most frightening discoveries, because it concerns language, the very thing human beings use every day as they use breath. The marketplace is where people exchange names, bargain, misunderstand, and repeat. In that world, words do not merely help us communicate, they also cause us to lose our way. Some words sound very clear, and yet are actually hollow. There are concepts used so often that people forget to ask what they truly mean. Some names seem to grasp things firmly, but are only labels pasted on the surface. And once language becomes careless, thought begins to wander astray with it. Human beings argue over words, believe in words, fear words, lull themselves to sleep within words, and then forget that reality does not always lie obediently inside the little box of its name. Bacon seems to be gently reminding us, do not hurry to believe that something which is clearly named has therefore been clearly understood. Many of humanity's greatest misunderstandings begin with words that are far too familiar. And then there is the idol of the theater. These are the systems of thought, the doctrines, the intellectual performances staged so beautifully that people enter them and forget that they are sitting before a theater. We are enchanted by coherence, by the authority of the speaker, by the completeness of the system. Everything sounds so reasonable, so tidy, so beautiful. But precisely because it is too beautiful, we forget to ask, is it true? Bacon had touched this weariness as early as Cambridge. He had seen intellect imprisoned in the beautiful cages of scholasticism, and here he speaks more plainly about what he had long sensed. Human beings are easily made to love carefully staged theaters of thought, and then call that enchantment truth. Those 4 idols on the surface are merely 4 concepts, but in truth they are like 4 layers of dust upon a mirror. The dust of human nature, the dust of the private self, the dust of language, the dust of intellectual performances. And Bacon seems to want to spend his whole life telling humanity one thing at once deeply humble and deeply great. Before you go seeking truth out there, clean the mirror first. Perhaps that is why his thought does not excite people in the way a slogan does. It makes them slow down. It compels people to become less confident in their own confidence. And in a world that always wishes to answer too quickly, that is a rare form of wisdom. But if Bacon had stopped merely at pointing out the layers of mist within the mind, he would have remained only a warner, not yet a guide. After speaking of distorted mirrors, he wished to do something far more difficult. To find a different way of seeing, a different path, a new method by which human beings would not only know that they are prone to error, but would also learn how to move slowly, bend low, observe, and draw near to truth, with hands no longer too trusting of their own illusions. After showing that the human mind often views life through layers of distorted mirrors, Francis Bacon did not stop at issuing a warning. He was not merely a man standing by the riverbank, saying that the water was muddy. He also wanted to find a way for human beings to wade in, slowly sift out the silt, and see the riverbed more clearly. It was from that longing that one of his most important works was born. Novum Organum. That title, if heard only in passing, may evoke something distant, scholarly, almost belonging to rooms full of dusty books and the soft scratching of pens across parchment. But if we walk slowly into it, we will see that this was not a book written to decorate the intellect. It was not written so that readers might admire how learned the author was, then close it, place it on a shelf, and let it sleep there like a beautiful object. No, Bacon wanted more than that. He wanted knowledge to work, to bend down before the world, to touch things themselves, to be capable of leading human beings from the darkness of speculation into the more difficult, yet truer, light of observation and experiment. One may say that in Novum Organum, Bacon was trying to change not merely a few conclusions, but the very way human beings go in search of conclusions. That was something immense. For many centuries, not a few people had grown accustomed to living within a culture of learning, where intellect was measured by skill in debate, by the ability to arrange concepts, or by the clever linking of propositions. But Bacon felt that this was not enough. He saw a manner of learning that often moved too quickly from abstract principles to sweeping conclusions, as though human beings could climb straight to the roof with nothing but a ladder made of words. To him, that was dangerous, for if the first rungs are set in the wrong place, the higher one climbs, the farther one moves from the truth. So Bacon proposed another path. To begin with small observations, concrete phenomena, patiently gathered facts, and then rise step by step, without haste, without leaping over stages, without loving a conclusion so much that one twists the evidence to serve it. That is the spirit of what people later came to call the inductive method, though in Bacon it was not merely a dry formula. It was almost an ethic of the intellect, an ethic that says, before making grand statements, learn to look carefully at small things. Before building a system, learn to listen to things themselves. Before wanting to be right, accept the possibility that you may be wrong. There is something very beautiful in that spirit, very humble and yet very strong. For Bacon understood that the world is not an obedient pupil sitting still while human beings recite its lesson. Nature does not open itself merely because we use beautiful words. It does not surrender its secrets simply because we were born in ancient lecture halls or wear lofty titles. If human beings wish to understand the world, they must learn a quality that is uncomfortable yet necessary, patience with what they do not yet know. And here, knowledge ceased to be a mere ornament. It was no longer something people wore upon themselves so that their intellect might shine in the eyes of others. It was no longer the fine clothing of debate. It became a kind of labor, a work involving the sweat of the spirit, a journey that required human beings to lower the ego, touch reality, make tables compare, eliminate, test again, and accept that truth is not something that arrives quickly just because we are impatient for it. In Bacon's world, the true seeker of understanding does not resemble an actor on a stage. He resembles rather a gardener in the early mist. His hands may be cold, his back may ache, the work may be repetitive and quiet, but it is precisely through that quietness that the seed of understanding is given a true chance to rise from the soil, rather than from declarations hanging in the air. Perhaps that is why Novum Organum is so important. It did not merely offer a new technique. It reshaped the character of the intellect. It reminded human beings that if they wish to draw near the truth, they must stop loving the beauty of their own ideas so much that they can no longer hear the voice of reality. They must accept that learning is not an act of possession, but an act of service. Service to what is truly there, rather than to the pride of the thinker. And from here, a phrase often associated with Bacon becomes easier to understand. Knowledge is power. But if one hears that phrase only in its crude sense, one understands him too narrowly. Bacon was not praising a form of power meant merely to dominate, to boast, or to impose. The power he had in mind, more deeply, was the ability to make human life less blind before nature, the ability to use understanding to improve reality, to lessen suffering, to widen the capacities of life, to make science a work of service rather than a medal for the ego. It was a profoundly modern dream, and also a deeply moving one. For amid a life stretched between court, law, ambition, and compromise, Bacon still kept within himself the belief that human intellect could be reorganized in a way more honest, more useful, closer to the earth. He did not want knowledge to live only in books. He wanted it to step out into the laboratory, the field, life, and the future. And yet, as in every great human story, it is often precisely where thought shines brightest that fate begins preparing a darker region to test the one who carries it. For how bitterly ironic it is that a man who devoted so much effort to teaching humanity how to cleanse error from its thinking could not keep his own life from the dust of power and interest. While the pages of his books had scarcely cooled from the smell of ink, while the dream of a knowledge devoted to life was still giving off its gentle yet enduring light. Elsewhere, in the rooms of the powerful, another examination was quietly taking shape, not between human beings and nature, but between Francis Bacon himself and the blurred stains in his own life, those stains that no method can easily wipe away by reason alone. There are rooms in a human life that, at first glance, still seem as bright as before. The curtains are still thick, the wood still polished, the footsteps of servants still soft and measured. And yet all it takes is a single event passing through, and suddenly all the light in that room changes color, not because the candles have grown weaker, but because the eyes that behold them are no longer the same. For Francis Bacon, the year 1621 was such a moment, when the chambers of power that had once lifted him so high suddenly became the place where the cracks he had long lived with, yet never truly escaped, were laid bare. This was not the fall of an unknown man. This was the fall of a man who had risen very high, a man who bore title, office, renown, and above all, the reputation of a great intellect. Precisely because he had stood so high, when he fell, the sound was no longer the private sound of one man's life. It became an echo that passed through an entire age. The accusations centered on the receipt of gifts and money, things that the language of history would later call by far colder names: corruption, bribery, abuse of office. But if we stop only at the surface of the charges, we will miss what makes this moment so painful. For here, what the world cannot forget is not merely that a high official stumbled because of power. What it cannot forget is that the man in question was Francis Bacon himself, the man who had devoted so much thought to reminding humanity of error, of illusion, of the layers of dust that gather upon the mirror of the intellect. And then, he himself was seen amid the dust. That is the irony that gives this story the shape of an almost classical tragedy. The man who taught others to stay alert before illusion could not keep his own life clear of the clouds of interest. The man who wished to open the way to a stricter method of seeking truth was himself drawn into a realm where truth was no longer merely an academic question, but a question about the quality of his own character. Perhaps we should walk very slowly through this part, for it is very easy to condemn, and also very easy to defend, but both make the story poorer. The world of power in that age operated in an atmosphere very different from the standards of transparency posterity would later desire. Gifts, favors, networks of obligation, mutual interests, all of these existed as part of the system. This does not erase the fault, but it does help us understand that Bacon did not stumble as some monstrous aberration in an otherwise immaculate world. He stumbled within a mechanism in which many had grown so accustomed to living that they no longer always saw clearly the boundary between what was accepted and what was shameful. But precisely because Bacon was Bacon, we cannot stop there. For he was not an ordinary man who did not know what he was doing. He was a man who understood very clearly that human beings are prone to deceive themselves. He knew that the mind loves to build beautiful justifications for choices it finds difficult to face directly. He knew that language can veil reality like a velvet curtain. He knew that power can make what is wrong gradually feel familiar, and what is familiar gradually be called by gentler names, so that conscience may ache a little less. Perhaps that is why the fall of 1621 was not merely a political failure. It resembled an inner examination, in which Bacon's whole life was compelled to stand before the very questions he had once posed to humanity. Can a man be very clear in thought, and yet clouded in life? Can a man see plainly the distorted mirror of humankind, yet fail to look long enough at the distortion in his own face? And does great knowledge truly protect a person from the familiar temptations of power, rank, and money? Or does it merely enable him to justify himself more elegantly? These are not comfortable questions, but precisely because they are uncomfortable, they make Francis Bacon a figure far deeper than many spotless, heroic portraits. We may imagine him in those days as a man standing in a room he knows high-telly, yet suddenly realizing that everything around him has changed its meaning. The chair is no longer a triumph. It has become evidence of fragility. The title is no longer a reward. It has become a garment too heavy when the wearer begins to lose the power to keep his balance. Even the pages he had once written, which made him believe that intellect could light the way for humanity, must at that moment have seemed to him tinged with a quiet sadness difficult to name. Not because they were false, but because the man who wrote them had not lived highly enough to stand wholly within the light of his own thought. And yet what makes this stretch of his life worth telling is not simply that Bacon fell. Many men have fallen. What makes it worth telling is the way he compelled history to preserve both sides of him at once. It is impossible to remember him merely as a power-hungry man who failed, for that would be too narrow. But it is also impossible to remember him only as a brilliant thinker, for that would be too indulgent. Bacon remains before posterity as a man of real light and real darkness, a man who helped to alter the way humanity thinks about knowledge, yet could not fully correct all the inclinations within his own life. And perhaps in some sense, it is precisely that imperfection that keeps him close to us. Most human beings do not live as symbols. We live as creatures who both understand and err, who wish to become higher than we are while still carrying our old weaknesses, who speak of what is right while sometimes straying from it. Bacon, in this fall, ceases to be a statue. He becomes a man again. That does not make his fault smaller, but it makes his tragedy deeper. When the shock had passed, what remained was not only the loss of office, the loss of honor, the loss of standing within the machinery of power. What remained was a silence. The silence after the banquet, after the defense, after the sound of the door closing, after the crowd has turned away. It is there that a man, if he remains honest enough with himself, is forced to sit alone with what he can no longer lay entirely at the feet of the age, of the system, or of any other curtain. And it is from that silence that another Francis Bacon would begin to appear, no longer at the center of the court, no longer walking the corridors in the shoes of office, but retreating toward the writing desk, ink ideas and dreams meant for the future. After public life had taken so much light from him, he would try to rekindle what remained of himself by another light, not the light of power, but the light of works written in solitude, where a man cast down from the summit still tries to send something beyond the ruin of his own collapse. After a person has passed through the summit and fallen, ordinary life does not immediately return. Everything is still there. Tables and chairs, stone walls, window frames, mornings when pale light spills through the curtains, nights when candles burn low upon the desk. But within that person, nothing is the same as before. For Francis Bacon, the final years of his life carried a very particular stillness, no longer the silence of preparation, but the silence of a man who had heard all too clearly the sound of his own fate breaking. And strangely enough, it was precisely in that stretch of life, which seemed to contain nothing but ashes, that he continued writing for the future. There is one kind of failure that causes a person to close inward, to want only to withdraw his hands from the world, to keep what remains of himself in darkness, and let the days pass like dying embers beneath cooling ash. But there is also another kind of failure. It takes away position without entirely extinguishing the will to create something larger than oneself. Bacon seems to have belonged to the latter kind. After the fall of 1621, he no longer walked the corridors of power with the bearing of a man helping direct the fate of a nation. The beautiful doors of the court had closed. The praises that had once surrounded him grew fewer. The light of office, at once warm and cold, had left his shoulders. But when the garment of power was taken away, another core part of Bacon remained, the belief that knowledge, if properly organized, could change human life. And so he returned to paper, to ink, to thought, to the quiet labor of a mind unwilling to surrender entirely before ruin. This was no longer the labor of a man still climbing. It was the labor of a man who knew he had come close to the end of the road, and for that very reason wanted all the more to leave behind a clearer blueprint for those who would come after. In these years, Bacon wrote, revised, expanded, and rearranged many of his works. He remained concerned with the classification of knowledge, the role of experience, and how a civilization might learn better, know better, and organize the study of the world more systematically. The pages he wrote during this period no longer carried only the energy of personal ambition. They carried something else as well, the urgency of time. When age and upheaval together lay a hand upon a person's shoulder, that person begins to understand that not many mornings remain in which to postpone. Perhaps Bacon felt that too, and for that reason, his final years should not be seen as the dim aftermath of a life that had missed its moment. More truly, they were the years in which he tried to distill the most essential part of himself, as though to say to the future, if my life can no longer retain its place within power, then let these ideas at least continue onward. There is something deeply moving in that image. A man who had once worn the silks of the court, once sat in great chairs, now bends for longer hours over the writing desk. No longer are there crowds of servants moving in and out. No longer the bustle of audiences and formal meetings. There is only the sound of pen upon paper, the sound of thought turning back upon itself like an old wheel, and the urge to send out something more enduring than reputation. In this silence, Bacon appears no longer as a statesman trying to keep his balance among innumerable tangled interests. Still, as an old craftsman striving to complete the final drawing for a structure he knows he will not live to see fully built. And that blueprint was not small. He dreamed of a world in which knowledge would not be left to the whims of individuals or the pride of a few isolated minds. He envisioned a learned culture able to cooperate, observe, experiment, and accumulate across generations. In other words, he began to think not only about ideas, but about the institutions of ideas, not only about what is true, but about how human beings might move together toward what is true in a more enduring way. That was a very great step, and a very modern one. Many people may think deeply, but few see far enough to understand that if knowledge is truly to change the world, it cannot live only in the minds of exceptional individuals. It must have a home. It must have a work rhythm. It must have discipline. It must have a community. It must have a future longer than the lifespan of any one person who writes it down. It is precisely here that the last 5 years of Bacon's life take on a strange beauty of ashes. Ashes usually suggest an ending. But sometimes, ashes are the final soil still warm enough to keep a seed alive through a cold night. Bacon, after his fall, no longer had enough fire to illuminate the court, but he still had enough warmth to shelter a few seeds of intellect and carry them into the future. Of course, sorrow did not vanish for that reason. A man who had once stood very high could hardly be completely at peace with all he had lost. Within the concentration of those final years, there was likely still the shadow of regret, of self-questioning, of a bitterness that a soul so full of ambition could not easily cast off with only a few pages of writing. But that is precisely what makes his labor all the more affecting. This was not the wisdom of a hermit standing outside life. This was wisdom written by a man who had gone too deeply into life, who had stumbled, who had been wounded by it, and who therefore understood all the more that the most enduring thing he could leave behind was not office, but a way of thinking. Perhaps for viewers today, especially for those who have passed through many seasons of life, this part of Bacon's story awakens a quiet sympathy. For anyone who has lived long enough knows, there are years when we build our careers, years when we endure the consequences, and also years when we want only to gather the brightest part still left within us and hand it on to those who come after, not to rescue our reputation, only so that what we have learned will not dissolve in vain. For Bacon, the final years were just that, a hand grown tired, yet still writing, a life cracked, yet still trying to shape a vision larger than itself for the future of knowledge. A man no longer standing at the center of power, yet still wishing to help clear the path for generations not yet born. And then, as the pages of the manuscript grew steadily thicker, another dream also began to emerge more clearly. Not only a method, not only a warning against error, but the image of an ideal community in which understanding would be nourished as a shared work of an entire civilization. There, between imagination and testament, between science and hope, Francis Bacon would still try to leave humanity one final chart before his own body quietly moved toward the last experiment of his life. Some people come to the end of life not in complete silence, but with an unanswered question still hanging in the air. A door not yet closed. A line of manuscript was left unfinished. A thought still suspended in the night like a lamp that has burned low, yet still refuses to go out. Francis Bacon seems to have been such a person. After those years in which power had wounded him, after the court had receded into the distance like a stage where the actor who once stood in the light could now hear only echoes from beyond the wings, Bacon returned to his deepest dream, not the dream of position, but the dream of a world in which knowledge is organized to serve humankind. That dream appears most clearly in New Atlantis. This is not merely a work of imagination. It is more like a chart that a mind nearing the end of its life tried to draw for the future. In those pages, Bacon does not construct a paradise of gold and silver, nor does he lose himself in sumptuous myths like many of his contemporaries. He builds instead an ideal society in which knowledge is nurtured through discipline, collaboration, observation, experiment, and through a profound belief that true understanding can make human life less burdened, less obscure, and less dependent on the darkness of not knowing. Within that imagined world, what shines most brightly is not palace or power, but a Solomon's house, an image that seems almost to crystallize the whole intellectual soul of Bacon. It is a place where people do not gather to argue brilliantly, nor adorn themselves with learning as though it were an ornament, but instead join together in a quieter and nobler labor. to observe nature, record phenomena, experiment, accumulate, sift, and then offer the results for the common good. In other words, in New Atlantis, Bacon is not only dreaming of knowledge, he is dreaming of a civilization that knows how to care for knowledge, as one tends a collective flame. This is beautiful and deeply moving as, well, for the man writing that dream was someone who had passed through too many dark regions of power. He knew how ambition could cloud the mind. He knew how fame could lift a person high and then cast him down with equal force. He knew how language could become a mask and how institutions could cause the human heart to tilt off balance. And yet after all that, he still retained enough faith to imagine a community in which knowledge would not be distorted by vanity, but preserved through responsibility and service. Perhaps that is the most endearing part of Bacon, not because he was innocent, nor because he was complete, but even though he himself did not live a life wholly free of stain, he never ceased to think of a better order for humankind. He still wished to leave behind a compass for the future, and then, as though life wished to write for him an ending both fitting in spirit and bitter in tone, Bacon's death also came within the orbit of an experiment. It is said that on a dull, cold day, he conceived the idea of testing whether snow might help preserve meat. It was a very Baconian thought, not merely to reflect within a closed room, but to lay hands upon reality, to test a hypothesis, to see how nature would respond when a human being put the right question to it. But that very pause in the cold to experiment caused him to catch a severe chill, and not long afterward, he died. This is an ending almost unbearably symbolic. A man who had spent his life urging humanity to rise from the overly comfortable chairs of speculation, to step out and observe, to experiment, to touch the real world, in the end departed in precisely such an act. Not amid battle, not in court, not beneath the medals of office, but in the midst of a small experiment, ordinary, physical, deeply material, and wholly true to the spirit of one who believed that truth must pass through the hand, through the eye, through verification. That death, therefore, is not merely an unusual detail of biography. It feels like a final period written in the very substance of his life. A period both beautiful and sad. Beautiful, because it shows that to the very end Bacon remained a man of questions, of observation, of an unwillingness to rest inside ready-made knowledge. Sad, because that experiment too remained unfinished, like so many other things in his life. Many of his dreams did not live long enough to see themselves fulfilled. Many of the designs he drew were only built much later by humanity, with real brick, real stone, and real institutions. Many things he perceived intuitively had to wait for later generations to transform them into modern science, research institutes, scholarly communities, and machines of discovery on a scale far greater than his own age could sustain. Bacon therefore departed in a very strange posture, not entirely as a victor, and yet not one who can simply be called a failure. If one looks only at his political life, one may see a man marked by many blurred stains, many compromises, many downfalls. If one looks only at his thoughts, one may see one of the great pioneers of the modern age. But if one looks at both together, one sees a deeper portrait, a human being both imperfect and illuminating, carrying the dust of the world upon him, and yet leaving to the future a brighter direction. Perhaps that is why Francis Bacon is still worth listening to in the night, not because he makes admiration easy, but because he makes us think more gently, more slowly, and more truthfully, about the human condition itself. We may clear the path for others and still lose our own way in life. We may see far into the future and still fail to rescue a few errors in the present. We may be full of flaws and yet still leave behind a seed that, if posterity knows how to tend it, will blossom into an entire garden. And now, as the final candle of this story has burned low, as the snow of that unfinished experiment also seems to be slowly melting within memory, we may close the door on the 17th century and return more closely to the room of our own lives, to the years that belong to us. For there are some people who only truly complete the circle of their lives when we bring them back into the present, as though placing an old ember into the hands of today, and then quietly asking ourselves, amid the world of our own age, so bright, so fast, and so full of voices, what is Francis Bacon still whispering to the year 2026? Let the breath slow a little, slow like the lamp in the room has just been turned down one notch lower, still bright enough for us to see the way, yet gentle enough that the heart does not have to remain awake too long with the hurried movements of the world. Breathe in, as though you were inviting stillness to enter. Breathe out, as though you were gently sending the noises of a long day out through the door. The endless chain of news headlines, the overly certain titles, the cold brightness of screens, the arguments that arrive faster than thought itself, and the claims that are sometimes far greater than the portion of truth lying within them. And now, as the story of Francis Bacon has nearly completed its circle, we return to the year 2026, our own age, an age very bright, very fast, full of data, full of voices, full of information, but for that very reason, it was full of mist as well. Perhaps this is the first thing Bacon would say to us, if tonight he could still sit down in this room beside a low candle and look for a long while at the weary faces of the modern age. Human beings do not lack information. Human beings cannot pass through information without being deceived by themselves. It is a lesson that sounds simple, but the longer one lives, the deeper it seems. In the year 2026, human error no longer comes chiefly from a lack of knowledge as it once did in distant times. On the contrary, we are living amid a sea of words, a storm of data, an unceasing current of images, comments, conclusions, analyses, predictions, and warnings. What this age lacks is not something to read, but how to read without losing one's way. It is not something to know, but how to know without believing too quickly. And here, Bacon appears as a very gentle and very stern reminder. Before asking whether the world is right, ask first through what kind of glass your own mind is looking at the world. Are we looking through real experience or through old fear? Are we listening through reason or through what we already want to believe? Are we seeking truth or only seeking more evidence to defend the feelings we already possess? Bacon called these things idols, illusions that human beings unconsciously worship in their minds. And perhaps never has that lesson suited our age more than it does now. Today, false news can travel farther than a correction. An outrageous statement can be remembered longer than a careful analysis. A cleverly chosen word can make what sounds vague like the truth. A crowd can call something obvious simply because it has been repeated often enough. In such a world, Bacon does not teach us to doubt everything bitterly. He teaches something humbler, harder, and far more useful. Doubt the ease of your own mind. That is the first lesson. The second lesson is quieter still, but also more painful. Knowledge does not automatically make a human being moral. Bacon's life is a very sorrowful reminder of that. He saw many true things about the errors of humankind. He helped open the way to a new manner of thinking about method, observation, and intellectual responsibility. But he himself also stumbled in the life of power. And perhaps that is the part that has made his story endure for so long. Not because he was perfect, but because he was not. Not because he stood above humanity, but because he bore humanity's own cracks within himself. That is what makes Bacon's lesson more credible than spotless moral instruction. It reminds us that great understanding does not guarantee a soul that will not lose its way. Degrees, rank, analytical ability, a strong memory, sharp language, all these things may make a person impressive. Still, they do not necessarily make that person honest, just, or sufficiently self-examining. And so, if the year 2026 wishes to learn anything from Bacon, it is this: let knowledge walk together with moral responsibility. Knowing more is not enough. One must know what one is using that knowledge for. To serve truth, or to adorn the ego. To illuminate a problem, or to overpower others. To help make the world less obscure, or to make one's own voice echo louder in the crowd. Bacon's third lesson is perhaps the most beautiful of all. Truth does not belong to the one who speaks the loudest. It often belongs to the one patient enough to observe longer. The world of today loves speed, loves quick reaction, loves early conclusions, loves answers that fit on a small screen. But truth rarely lives in boxes that are too neat. It needs time. It needs a method. It needs the ability to say, I do not yet know enough to conclude. It takes the courage of someone who is not ashamed to move more slowly than the crowd, to come closer to what is real. In that sense, Bacon was not only a man of science, he was also a man of intellectual humility. And perhaps this is the thing viewers today, especially those who have lived many years, may feel most deeply. For if one has lived long enough, one understands that life does not reward a person merely for being certain. Sometimes, life opens itself only to those who know how to keep a small space within the mind. A space for listening, for revising, for being less stubborn, for accepting that one too may have seen wrongly. In a world of too much information, perhaps peace does not come from reading endlessly more. Peace comes from knowing how to filter, how to doubt in the right place, how to be silent at the right moment, and how to keep one's mind from becoming an overly noisy marketplace. In the end, Francis Bacon does not give us a magical key that opens every truth. He gives us an attitude: clean the mirror before blaming the landscape for being distorted. Correct your way of thinking before loudly trying to correct others. Use knowledge as a work of service, not as a cloak that makes you appear taller. And as the night settles a little lower, as this room too grows gradually more still, perhaps that is the gentlest gift Bacon sends to the year 2026. In the midst of an age with too many voices, human beings may still choose to live one beat more slowly, to think one step more carefully, and to keep the mind a little clearer before laying a hand upon any conclusion. Now let this story close like the surface of a lake becoming smooth after the last ripples have passed. Out there, the world may still be noisy, but in this room, only the even rhythm of breathing remains, the gentle lamplight, and a quiet thought staying with us before sleep. Sometimes the nearest road to truth is not to move very quickly toward the world, but to sit still a little longer and realize What layer of mist is resting within our own eyes?